Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators Spring 2021 meeting, focusing on some of the most important issues facing the Hispanic community. My name is Daniel Avisoto, and I'm the president of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. The first part of today's program focuses on the reopening of schools and priorities. The COVID-19 epidemic upended our educational system. No community was spared, but Latinos and other people of color were particularly impacted by problems with distance learning, worsening the achievement gap. As schools fully reopen for the fall semester, the focus cannot be just on safety, but on making up for that lost achievement. To talk about this and other issues, we are pleased to have the Secretary of Education, the Honorable Miguel Cardona, who will be interviewed by a high school teacher, Nevada Assemblywoman Selena Torres, who is also chair of the Nevada Latino Legislative Caucus. Following that interview, we will be joined by Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers. Mr. Secretary, please.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you, President Daniel Avisoto, for the warm welcome. And for the partnership, I want to start off by saying I'm honored to be with you, and I appreciate the leadership across the country that all of the legislators have put in to try to make sense of this challenge that we've experienced together. And like you alluded to, President, we are in a position of leadership and we have the privilege of building back better. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do it together. We know that this past year and a half has been like no other. So that's why it is my priority to make sure that we're safely reopening schools as quickly as possible, that we're putting the resources where they're needed most. And we know our Latino students have been negatively impacted by the pandemic in many serious ways. We also know that Latinos are groups of folks who have experienced some of the worst impacts of the pandemic, not only with education and access to in-person learning or access to quality remote learning, but also with their health. We know that the mortality rate amongst Latinos was worse. So what that means is the students that we're going to be getting back are students who have experienced more trauma. So we need to make sure we're prepared to meet our students' needs, not only their academic needs, but their social and emotional needs, and their trauma needs, their mental health needs. The American Family Plan and the budget that the president put forward are really bold steps, not only to reopen schools, but really reimagine them to places where we want to send our children. I can tell you, and I don't have to tell you because you've been leading through this process where we know Latino students are underserved and are underperforming compared to their peers. And that's been that way ever since I've been a student. And as an educator, I've seen it and I've made it my life's goal to improve that. As a father of 2 Latino children, it's my humble privilege to serve as Secretary of Education, but I want to make sure that my children's future is not predicted by their skin color or their zip code. So the American Family Plan, the transformational shift to provide early childhood education, increase in Pell Grants, 2 years of free community college, that's a game changer for our Latino students, for all of our students. The budget that promotes community schools where we know many of our students have needs that go beyond the academic. So full service community schools are able to meet their needs, whatever they are, by bringing in resources from the community into the schools. I'm excited about the potential to champion these efforts, in addition to making sure that every penny of the American Rescue Plan goes toward the intent that Congress had, to make sure we're supporting our students, building back better, but also making sure we're targeting efforts to those students that were impacted the most, like many of the Latino students that you represent. We're working at the agency really hard to be partners. I'll be very honest with you. I want to make sure that we're rebranding our agency. We're a support agency, not a compliance agency. We're a support agency. We support you so that you could do your jobs to support the students you serve and the communities you serve. And to do that, we've worked really hard since I've come on board. even before, to identify very clear guidance on school reopening that includes not only the safety and mitigation strategies, which we know are important, but also focus on how to address gaps that have widened because of the pandemic, how to address the social emotional needs of our learners, how to address our educators and supporting them. We can't expect our students to be supported if we're not supporting our educators. So the guidance is coming out. We have a summer learning collaborative where we're sharing best practices around summer learning experiences. Listen, we can't have summer school like it used to be. It has to be experiential. Students have to be engaged. They have to be outdoors. We really need to make sure we're having summer programs where students are wanting to engage. We also have a repository of best practices. We got over 1,100 submissions when we asked, what are you doing to help reopening and to make sure that the social and emotional well-being of students is being taken into account? 1,100 submissions. We have amazing examples from across the country, urban centers, rural centers. We have cities, we have East Coast, West Coast. So please take advantage of that, look at that, look for ideas. We want to support, we want to serve, but we know that our goals are critically important. For our Latino families, many of us have either had lukewarm experiences with schools or maybe haven't felt as connected as we want you to be. So it's really on us to make sure we're doing more to engage our families, especially Latino families, even if you're monolingual Spanish speaking. We serve you. So we have to make sure that that's the message that we're sending here at the Education Department. And another message from my colleagues across the country is we need to make sure we're supporting our Latino families who still have hesitancy with the vaccine to get the vaccine. It's safe. I vaccinated my own children as soon as they were able to get vaccinated. And we're all doing our part to make sure that we can reopen schools in our communities with safety at the center of the conversation. I'm going to close my remarks by saying something that I know you know. En la unión está la fuerza, right? And that we're stronger together. And we didn't ask. Many of us came on before the pandemic. Some of us signed up during the pandemic. But there is no playbook for the pandemic. But together, we can make sure that we reopen our schools and just think about public education and schools in general in a different way, and make sure that it's better than it was before. For the Latino students who are waiting, who historically have seen that Latino students have less opportunities or maybe gaps in opportunities or in outcomes, this is our moment. This is our moment to rewrite that. And I look forward to working with you, to partnering with you, to learning from you, but most importantly, to sharing that sense of urgency that should not dissipate once the masks are off. Once the schools are reopened, we should maintain that level of urgency to work together to get it done. I look forward to that. And I look forward to the questions, and I look forward to our partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's bring in Assemblywoman Torres from Nevada, who, in addition to being a policymaker, is a high school teacher. And so she's been on the front lines on the ground. Assemblywoman.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning here in Nevada. It's so great to be with you here today, Secretary Cardona. And today's actually a really exciting day here in Nevada because the governor is going to be signing the English Language Learner Bill of Rights here in Nevada at Valley High School, which is my alma mater in Las Vegas. I'm actually at Valley High School, so if your bell goes off or you hear some riffraff, it might be because students are here. They're continuing to learn during summer school here in Nevada. And we have a couple questions for you, so I'd like to dive right in if that's all right.
Sure.
Latinos make up over 25% of the nation's K-12 public school student population. The only two Latinos we've had in charge of the Department of Education served short stints. Lauro Cavazos for just over 2 years, from 1988 to 1980, and John King Jr. for just a year at the end of President Obama's term. We're very proud and excited for your appointment. How does it feel to be the agenda-setting Secretary of Education for President Biden? And what is your vision for your role, both as an educator and as a Latino?
Thank you for that. And it's so nice to be with you. I'm glad you're in a school. I'm glad you're getting that bill signed. How important is that for our English learners? That we value them and we recognize that being an English learner and being bicultural is such an asset. And that's what I bring here. And I'll be very honest with you, Selena. For me, it's extremely humbling. I'm here because my grandparents gave up so much. Like many of you on this call, I'm the beneficiary of sacrifices that my grandparents made when they left Puerto Rico to look for work, where they left a paradise island to go live in the projects, cut tobacco so that their children have a chance at education. And, I stood on the shoulders of giants. My best teachers are my parents, my grandparents, and esos modales, esa experiencia que ellos tuvieron has carried me, and I lean on their strength with the job ahead. And I don't take it for granted for one moment that there are so many students who are living my grandparents and my parents' experience because they just got here, or they left a beautiful place to come here to learn a language that they don't really know in a culture that they don't really feel comfortable with. So I'm proud to serve as como dije en la entrevista, yo soy as American as apple pie and rice and beans. Tengo el orgullo de ser latino, pero sé que también hay muchos mirando, and I have to make sure that I serve all students and that it's a bonus that I'm a Latino. It's a bonus that I'm bicultural, ¿verdad? So the agenda is really important. Equity, access for all students, and ensuring that all students, while they're making it forward, they don't lose who they are. And, I don't have to tell you, you're going to have an event today where you're signing that bill where we show value. So we need to value the biculturalism. We need to value the assets that our students bring, and not say, I need that to be dormant while you assimilate and learn these. There's so much growth. 25% of our students across the country. That number is just going to grow. So for me, it's really about making sure access and equity is there at the pre-K-12 level. The American Family Plan provides 2 years of 4-year-old pre-K programs. Think about the benefits for our students who are learning English, where we don't have to intervene later, right? Community college for many of our students where they don't even think about college because they're like, I can't bring additional burdens to my family on costs. So there's so much potential for our Latino students, for all students in general, but in particular for our Latino students who have been underserved historically. So that's another priority for me, ensuring quality programming at the pre-K-12 level and affordability and accessibility at the higher education level.
Thank you, Secretary. We're so excited to see what you do. And I love that saying, as American, as apple pie and rice and beans. I remember going to school and bringing my frijoles with me and people looking at what are you eating? But I love my frijoles and I still bring them to work to this day.
Wow.
My students appreciate it.
Yes,
Latinos and other people of color were particularly impacted by the problems with distance learning during the school closures due to the pandemic. And we saw that hard and heavy here in Nevada and throughout the Las Vegas Valley. And this worsened the already existing achievement gap. As schools fully reopen for the fall semester, how do we make up for this lost achievement?
Yeah, thank you for that. When we talk about equity, a lot of people bring up equity, right? They say, we have to be equitable. What does that mean? Is equity a thing that we do in the summer so that we can go back to business as usual in the fall? Or do we have a different mindset to make sure that we're meeting students where they are academically and emotionally at all times, and we're giving them what they need and what they want, that we're engaging with families that traditionally are not engaged with our schools, not because of anything they're doing wrong, but because they might be working so much that we have to change our practices to engage them in a way where they feel comfortable. Right. So I'm going to take a moment to plug the Equity Summit that we're having. There's a series of equity summits that we're having starting next week. Check it out on our website. It's an opportunity for us to engage in that conversation. What does this mean? And as policymakers who are on this call, I stand with you, and I know it's going to be challenging, but let's maintain that level of urgency about visiting our policies. Not only now when we're in the middle of a pandemic or we're at the tail end of it, or where we were last year, but next year, because the data before the pandemic needed work. And this is the closest we're going to get to the reset button, right? So let's maintain a level on equity, focus on equity in our policies. And when we talk about the digital divide, I'll tell you very quickly, Selena, when this happened, I was Commissioner of Education in Connecticut. I remember speaking to a very wealthy district superintendent. And he said, Miguel, we just flip the switch. All of our students had laptops, devices that they've been using for years, strong Wi-Fi signal, great curriculum on the other end of the screen. All we had to do was flip the switch. Then I talked to a superintendent in a community that was mostly Black and brown, very high poverty. And it took 4 weeks to connect with those students. 4 weeks. And I don't mean connect through Wi-Fi. So the disparities were made worse. We need to act boldly, and it's going to make people feel uncomfortable. But my saying is, if we go back to school and we're not making people feel uncomfortable, we're not pushing hard enough. So yes, we have to break convention. We have to make sure that the digital divide is behind us. We have to, with the American Rescue Plan, the resources are there. We need to match the urgency of the president with the will to make decisions that are going to close gaps and create opportunities for students who have historically not had it. And I mean, I could go on for an hour about this, but I know our time is short. But focused urgency on policy at the legislative level.
And, you know, I think one of those areas that we know that we need to create substantially more policy is regarding our English learners. And, you know, I like to look at our English learners. Our National Teacher of the Year is actually from Nevada, and she recently said, you know, they're not just English learners, right? They're linguistically gifted. And so, you know, at least 10 states have K-12 student populations that are linguistically gifted, that are English language learners that have over 10% of their student population. And you were once one of them. So how do we help our English language learner students succeed?
Thank you for that question. Let me tell you, if those of you on the call don't know the National Teacher of the Year yet, Google her. Juliana is amazing, great ambassador for the profession. I was with her yesterday on a call, and I had several opportunities to engage with her. When we're thinking about reopening schools and thinking about teachers, please watch a video of Juliana and what she stands for, and know that when you're making tough legislative decisions, think of Juliana, because that's the motivation you're going to need to fight and push, because we have educators across the country that care for kids. I love the framing of that. Linguistically talented or linguistically gifted. That's the mindset we need as we move forward. With regard to English learners, listen, there's very few areas in education where I feel the research and the practice are not working together more than with English learners. You know, read Jim Cummings or Steve Krashen and just how Virginia Collier. Listen to how the research says how language is learned, and then look at the practices that we have. To me, that's not only negating the practice, but devaluing our learners. So let's start following the research on this. Okay, 25% of our students are Hispanic or Latino. We know many of them come from homes where they might be monolingual Spanish. So if we don't start following the practices, if we don't start following the research on what's best for English language learners, then it's going to hurt all of our students' growth. The research is very clear on what's best for these students, Selena. We need to prioritize that as legislators. We need to make sure that this is not just an EL issue. I think sometimes when we put issues in buckets, we trivialize them. This is an issue for everyone in the whole state, in the whole country. So we need to lift those practices. We know what works. Why are we not employing those practices? And this is the time now where we need to act with urgency to make sure we're meeting the needs of these learners, especially because they were hit hardest by the pandemic.
Yeah, and you know, throughout my education to be an educator, you know, I know that we talked a lot about, you know, ensuring that ELL practices are not just for ELL students, they're for all students. And so I know that, you know, by improving our education system for English language learners, we really improve education for all learners throughout education.
Absolutely. Listen, I learned this sheltered instructional observation protocol, SIOP model, and I thought to myself, well, these practices are just good teaching practices. So when I was in the classroom, I used that. When I was a principal, I taught it to the teachers who didn't have English learners per se, because it was just good teaching practices. Let me tell you, the English language learner practices are some of the best teaching practices out there. We need to embed them in our instruction daily.
Thank you. And you know, our Hispanic caucus has several other K-12 priorities that have been set as well, including promoting ethnic studies, improving or mandating universal age-appropriate LGBTQ positive sex education, including consent, ending school lunch shaming that we kind of talked a little bit about earlier today, and fostering good counseling towards college and apprenticeships. Do you plan to set a leadership agenda for any of those priorities, and what can we do as state legislators to help?
Thank you very much. You know, a lot of the education policies really lands at the state level. I'll tell you, when I was commissioner in Connecticut, there was a legislative push to have Black and Latino studies required in every high school in Connecticut. Doesn't mean every kid has to take it, but it has to be offered in every school. You know, so not to say that that's something that I want to see across the country but I love the fact that we understand the importance of ethnic studies. When students see themselves, when they're seen in the curriculum, when they're seen in front of the classroom, when they see people that look like them teaching or positions of leadership, it does something to them. It did for me when I was a student. So I really feel that while education policy, in particular legislation on curriculum, really lies at the state level, I ask you to take a look at it and see, are the students that I serve being seen in the curriculum? Do they feel like it's for them? Do they feel welcome in this school environment? Are their voices being heard? Do they look in their books and see characters that represent their story? If the answer is no, we got work to do. So I'm just going to point to that one, but I'm also going to spend just a fraction of a second talking about the importance of the Latino community standing up for LGBTQ rights. I'll tell you why, because we don't like when Latinos are pushed aside. Dr. King said it much more eloquently, but any injustice towards a human is an injustice toward all. This is our opportunity to make sure we're supporting our learners who are LGBTQ and making sure that we're showing leadership because all means all. We need to have schools that are safe of harassment for all students, including students who right now, it seems like they're being targeted across the country. So it's on us to stand up for all students.
Yeah, 100%. And, I think that's one of the great things about our classrooms, right, is making them welcoming spaces for our students. And there's so many ways that we do that through curriculum and through just creating that environment. So I'm happy that you hit on that, because it really is important that the Latino community stands up for the LGBTQ community as well. I think, Secretary, well, we've hit on a lot of different topics regarding to K through 12 education, but, the Secretary of Education also oversees higher education. And I think one of the things that was a big part of not only the election, but I think has been a big issue impacting a lot of the constituents in my community has just been college student loan debt. And how do we provide relief to those that were already impacted by college pricing and now find themselves unable to achieve formally common financial milestones like buying a home because of this crippling student loan debt? President Biden has asked you to research if he has the authority to forgive student loans by executive action. And do you have any previews or updates on what that looks like?
Sure. I'll talk really quickly about that because I know that's a question on everyone's mind. We're currently working with the White House and Department of Justice to see what flexibilities or what authorities we have, and we're having those conversations regularly. That is ongoing. And while I don't have anything to announce there, I will tell you that the cost of college has become a barrier for so many students, especially students, Latino students, first-generation students. As they would say in my home growing up, un revolú. So we got to fix it, right? So we have to look at public service loan forgiveness and be serious about it. 98% of the people who applied were denied. That's unacceptable. We have to look for borrower defense. We have to look at it more carefully because students have been taken advantage of by misconduct of institutions. And unfortunately, many of these students end up in greater debt. We know Black and brown students end up owing more over time because of the interest rates. So I hired Rich Cordray. He joined a team recently to look at FSA and make sure we're doing what we need to do in-house at the Department of Education to prevent students from being taken advantage of, to make sure that college is more affordable and accessible. And then with the American Families Plan, the president is proposing a $1,400 increase of Pell Grants for all students and $400 in the budget. So, there's an increase there that will help students, but we are going to be working with a high sense of urgency to make sure everything that we do control, we're doing it well and serving our students better. They deserve it, especially those students who maybe feel like they don't have access to college because it's too expensive. We have to stop that.
I really appreciate that response. Teaching high school, I work with a lot of kids that are wondering whether or not they'll have the opportunity to go to college. And so it's really critical that we address this issue, and that we don't just address it once it's become student debt, but that we address it early on. At this moment, I know that Senator Ivy Soto is on, and he also has a question for you, Secretary.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Assemblywoman Torres, and thank you for that vibrant interview that the two of you had. I do have one quick special follow-up question for the Secretary. And señor Secretario, casi todos los estudiantes de escuelas públicas en Puerto Rico son de familias bajo el nivel de pobreza. Y en las pruebas estandarizadas están saliendo peor que en cualquier otra jurisdicción en los Estados Unidos. ¿Qué puede usted hacer y qué podemos hacer todos para corregir esta situación?
Gracias por la pregunta, nuestra isla del encanto. Yo te digo, como latino, como boricua, me siento orgulloso de tener esta posición y poder asistir y ayudar en Puerto Rico, porque yo sé que hay necesidad y yo sé que la gente de Puerto Rico lo pueden hacer. Estamos proveyendo fondos, no solamente en el Rescue Plan, pero también fondos 912 millones de dólares para poder ayudar a los estudiantes en la isla y reconstruir donde se necesita reconstruir. Me siento orgulloso que estoy en la posición ahora para ayudar y quiero que sepan la gente de la isla que lo apoyo y vamos a trabajar juntos para poder darle la oportunidad a nuestros estudiantes y invertir innovaciones para poder darle una educación buena y para que puedan crecer emocionalmente los estudiantes, porque ellos pasaron mucho trauma con el huracán, con el terremoto y ahora COVID. Vamos a estar ahí soportando a los estudiantes y los maestros allá en Puerto Rico. Y yo sé que lo vamos a hacer juntos. Me siento muy, como le dije, orgulloso de ser latino y puertorriqueño. Mis padres nacieron allá. Yo nací aquí, pero mis padres nacieron allá y me siento bien contento que voy a poder ayudar en Puerto Rico pronto.
Muchísimas gracias por esa respuesta. Y siendo caribeño también, mi familia es cubana.
Sí.
Es una cosa muy importante que le ayudamos a los que son parte de este país
Claro.
y que se reconozca también especialmente los problemas que han tenido precisamente entre huracanes y terremotos y entonces COVID y todo lo demás.
Sí.
Así que muchísimas gracias por eso.
Un placer y saludos a mi amiga allá, Randi Weingarten.
Sí, sí.
Espero que le vaya bien. Gracias por la oportunidad. Yo sé que juntos vamos a lograr mucho. Como le dije ahorita, en la unión está la fuerza. Me siento orgulloso de servirle a ustedes y espero verlo pronto en el futuro en persona. Cuídense.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I did let Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, who's with me here for a very rare in-person interview, but I did advise her, we might do this in Spanish. Good
luck, Randy.
Yeah, exactly.
But Mr. Secretary, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Take care. Bye-bye.
So let me start.
See, this is how, Spanish-speaking kids who don't know English, kind of like that moment of fear when you're like, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to understand half of what's about to happen.
Correct.
Exactly right.
Yes.
It's exactly that lived experience for that moment. So thank you.
Yes, well, so we will switch back to English for this.
Gracias.
For this. And I want to start by asking you, the AFT and you in particular have been at the forefront of schools reopening. In fact, you were talking about schools reopening while schools were still closing.
Yes.
Back in April of last year.
Yes.
And that was, if memory serves me, when the first report came out on this. And we're at a totally place now in the summer of 2021 than we were in the spring of 2020. As we transition to this towards the fall, what are the key pillars that need to be in place in order to safely reopen schools for in-person teaching and in-person learning?
So first off, I really appreciate the interview, and I really appreciate you remembering that. And I know, Senator, that people in New Mexico use the report that we put out. Mm-hmm. So let me just say, number one, there's three key pillars, and there's a lot of work we have to do underneath each of them. Number one is we are in a fundamentally different place today because of the vaccines than we have been at any time since the onset of COVID. These vaccines really work. And so even though other kind of mitigation factors are important, the vaccines have been real game changers. And the more we can engage more and more Americans to get shots in the arm at the very same time as the Biden administration is rightly helping the rest of the world, the better off we'll be. And so we have still an issue about what happens in elementary schools because the vaccines won't be available to younger kids under 12 before school starts. So the mitigation factors are still important. But at the end of the day, if we can get to herd immunity, that's going to be the key to normalcy without this kind of polarization and the polarization and politicization of science. So number one becomes reopening and staying open with a consistency so that people don't have, if there's variants or some other things, that there's a closing, opening, closing, opening. So reopening safely and staying open, creating the trust and confidence that we can keep the education community safe. That's number one. Number two is recovery. And a lot of people start talking about learning loss. This was an education disruption. When you talk about it in terms of learning loss, it creates a sense that somebody's to blame. And COVID was to blame here. And there's too much politicization about all of this anyway. We can litigate over, the last administration's response and I would argue that it wasn't a terribly good one. Others may say COVID didn't really affect people. I mean, we can argue about all that, but that's not going to help any child deal with economic or deal with academic, emotional, social recovery. So we have to focus on, leave the politics for who's to blame to politics. And in education, let's focus on that recovery. And that recovery includes academic acceleration, academic recovery, academic acceleration, but also emotional and social recovery and acceleration. And number three, this is actually an opportunity to seed a renaissance in terms of public schooling. And why do I say that? Because one of the things that is clear from both the right and the left wing and everybody in between is that public schooling in place, in person, is really important. It's important for kids. It's important for communities. It's important for our economy. It's important for stability. It's important for normalcy. And so place-based, in-person based, we've learned a lot that that's really important. So how do we then make that, all of our schools, places where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids thrive? And there's a whole bunch of things that we can do. But if we actually reopen with joy, with the kind of resources in place for emotional, social, and academic recovery, and create a lot of joy and a lot of hope about how schools are foundational to our communities, we're going to be in a lot better shape come the summer and the fall than not only were we during COVID, but pre-COVID.
Well, as the father of a first grade, 7-year-old student, and I couldn't agree with you more. This is parents need to have the certainty that they can go back to work.
Exactly right.
As well, because their kids are going to be able to stay in school on a regular basis, and making sure that we have those protocols in case. And by the way, I should mention to everybody that we are both vaccinated.
Yes.
As we're sitting closer to than 6 feet right now, and we actually had a logistical conversation just to make sure that we were all able to do this. Secretary Cardona just talked about the growing diversity in our schools, especially Latino children who are the majority of some districts. And Assemblywoman Torres also asked him about ethnic studies and the needs of English learners, right? So I know that you've called for more diversity among teachers. How does that needed diversity tie into those topics, and how do we achieve it?
So this is hard to do in any time, and it's really hard to do now because you have this kind of pushback about the question of whether diversity and inclusion is important. And so let me, regardless of whether it gets me in trouble or not, let me start with the value proposition that de Tocqueville started with when this country, America, was founded 200 years ago. which is that diversity and inclusion are part of what makes America America. Most of us came from or our parents, grandparents came from somewhere else. You know, we came to America, with the exception of those who came enslaved. We came to America for a different future, for a more hopeful future. That's what the Statue of Liberty says to us in that New York harbor. So for the America that I believe in, the America that I think most of the country was framed on, is one that is open and embracive to all sorts of differences. And that our strength is in creating a collective character that pulls together a common identity, but also embraces and values the diversity. And so that's part of the reason why people like Ronald Reagan were in favor of immigration reform. So we have a political job to try to create and recreate a consensus around that. Having said that, in the education realm, we need to make sure that we value every child's lived experience. And one of the ways of valuing that is to actually make sure that kids see themselves in some people who are teaching them. It may not be everyone, but they have to see themselves. They have to see someone who looks and sounds like them. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. And frankly, I would argue that white kids need to see Latino teachers, need to see Black teachers. We need to be able to see that kind of diversity in a way that you undermine fear of the other. So diversity is important in terms of that, but equal to diversity is the value of having a welcoming and safe place to learn. Kids thrive if it's welcoming and safe. So if you have a language barrier, that's not going to be welcoming and safe. A language barrier creates a sense of tension and anxiety that I can't understand. So part of what we need to do is we need to be multilingual. We need to create the kind of linguistic opportunity so that we can actually move to whatever, the dominant language in America is English. That's, how
in
we,
most places.
in most places, and frankly, in the age of technology, that's the dominant language in most places. But we have to create a pathway and a highway to that so that kids can thrive and that their parents of English language learners feel like the school is accessible. And frankly, the other thing we've learned is that dual language schools actually are great academic accelerants for all kids. So figuring out how to be multilingual, figuring out how to be culturally responsive is a win-win experience for all kids in America. And I talk about it that way because part of what our job is as educators is to find the naysayers, to find the people who feel like something is hurting them, something is changing their lives, to say, no. This is actually going to be a win-win situation. We're not taking anything away from you. We're actually enhancing everyone's experience in America.
So, in fact, you gave a speech earlier this year, at the beginning of this year, I think it was, the Freedom to Thrive.
Yeah.
In which you talked about, and you highlighted several programs around the country, but you talked about how we get teachers into the pipeline, what the diversity is, and what that impact is on the students. Many of the points you just made right here.
Right.
Are there particular aspects of the Freedom to Thrive, which I really found as a very inspirational speech when I listened to it, that should be highlighted as we talk about these issues?
Yes, I think that there should be, but it becomes, I spend a lot of time in rural America. Look, I grew up in Rockland County, New York, which was a small town about 30 minutes away without traffic, 30 minutes away from where the studio is right now, with traffic about 2 hours away. But most Americans want to have a better life for themselves and their kids. They want to be able to afford a vacation. They want to be able, and Dr. Cardona said it before, to send their kids to college or to some post-secondary opportunity, and for their kids to do better than they did. So the freedom to thrive actually simply means, how do we make sure that people in this country, can have the better life that they want, can actually thrive, can actually, afford retirement, can actually make sure that they don't worry about healthcare if, God forbid, somebody's sick, can actually have decent wages so that they can make all sorts of decisions about how to spend, wages, as opposed to, oh my God, if I pay my rent right now, I can't pay for food.
Right.
I mean, it's not just about having the opportunity for skills and knowledge and education. It is much more holistic. It's about economic as well as education opportunity. And it's also through the lens of justice, so that there's a shot of equality for everyone, that we don't have this kind of huge gap between the rich and everybody else. And that's why we started using this term, freedom to thrive, because it should be about how when you close your eyes, what's the commonality in America? It's about making sure that our kids' lives are better than our lives. And so in terms of the different kind of levers, there's a collective bargaining lever. That's what do unions do. And you see, even now, with unions being much diminished from where they were 50 years ago, that there's still a union advantage. If somebody is in a union and has a collective bargaining contract, they tend to make more, and it tends to be more equal, meaning men and women don't have different wages. And there tends to be more fairness on the shop floor if you have a union card and a union contract. So unions are a way of being a lever to help the freedom to thrive. But government is too. So take what you've done in New Mexico, the community schools, the wraparound services, so that we wrap these services around schools. They're available to kids. That's going to make it. And I saw it in Rio Rancho when I was there doing my back to school tour. That's going to make it a lot more effective in terms of how we help kids recover, because that infrastructure of community schools and the wraparound services and parents feeling welcome is already there. Another program that you've done in New Mexico, which is part and parcel of this, is the Grow Your Own program, which I know you had a lot to do with passing a couple of years ago, as did the governor. But this notion of a sense of a career path for people in communities, that if you are start as a bus driver, or you start as a paraprofessional, and then you have a career path to being a school teacher. You have a career path to higher wages, and to also making a very big difference in the lives of kids. There's other ways of creating the diversity pipeline too. In Newark, New Jersey, which is right across the Hudson River from where we are right now, we worked with Montclair State University, a state university, with the Newark School District, with our local in Newark, the Newark Federation of Teachers, and we, or the NTU, the Newark Teachers Union, sorry, and we put together this program called the Teacher Academy. And so high school kids decide that they want to go into teaching. I just actually saw a program very similar to this in Providence, Rhode Island. Decide that they want to go into teaching, and they can, as they get their credits at Montclair, they can also work as paraprofessionals in the school district. Oh. And the program I started seeing in Providence, and this is just a couple of weeks ago, 3 Latino kids looking and saying, I want to come back to teach my colleagues. So there's really different ways, economically, educationally, justice-wise, in terms of how we help create this freedom to thrive. But often it's going to go through the education highway, because if you have the knowledge and skills that a student needs so that they can actually access the world, they can be critical thinkers, they can be civic participants, they can discern fact from fiction, they have marketable skills for college and career, that is a key touchstone to how we help everyone achieve.
By the way, I just comment that the one of the impacts of having been for the last year and a half on Zoom calls is I find myself giving nonverbal responses so as to not, right? Because we're all used on the Zoom.
Right. Are you on mute? Please mute yourself.
Exactly. But President Biden, shifting a little bit, President Biden has included public schools in many of the proposed areas of his infrastructure plan, and it includes $100 billion at this point to upgrade and build new schools, including indoor air quality, ventilation, water quality, energy efficiency, and improved school kitchens. How hopeful are you that this part of the plan survives? And how far do you think that the money will go to fix the disparities that particularly that impact children of color?
So, first off, the plan that he proposed was awesome. It and in both its macro and its micro elements. It's very similar to the plan that the Ed Committee Chair in the House of Representatives, Bobby Scott, had proposed a couple of years ago. It's absolutely needed. I mean, the civil engineers give our infrastructure a D- or D+. I don't quite remember what it is right now. We know that schools, which are basically the second largest infrastructure piece, if you look at what we have to build and what we have to retrofit. And it's also the place where our youngest, we're custodians of a new generation. So it's really important to do, and it's really necessary. I mean, take ventilation. 60% of the school districts, 40 to 60% of the schools need to have a ventilation fix. Mm-hmm. Think about what happened in this, in COVID. It's a respiratory disease. It's a respiratory virus. Those ventilation systems were really, really good. You could dissipate aerosolizing of this virus. But more than that, think about how many Black and brown kids have asthma. Think about what asthma does to a kid. So if you have a better ventilation system in a school,
regardless of the virus, kids are going to breathe better. Think about what that means with any kind of respiratory issues. Flu, colds, kids are going to be more healthy. It's a win-win situation. Same in terms of getting rid of the lead in water pipes. Think about if we can use those water fountains in schools. Think about all the jobs this creates. Think about if we could use solar power in schools and what kind of education idea that would be to teach kids about. So sure. So it's important to have the broadband. It's important to have the tech labs. It's important to have places so we can have community schools. But it's important to also make sure that these climate issues are done and dealt with in terms of breathing the air, drinking the water. And all of this creates good jobs. And those good jobs beget other jobs. So as we're getting out of COVID, if we had this huge super start of the economy in terms of rebuilding, it's a win-win-win situation. So in the last 5 minutes we have,
sorry, no, I talk about schools and kids all the time.
This is wonderful, and I'm very much enjoying this conversation. And we need to have you back when we have an in-person meeting, and we can do this with a crowd and take questions from the audience and the whole bit. But we do have another program on fighting the wave of disenfranchisement bills coming up in just a few minutes, and we're going to be joined by Stacey Abrams,
right?
Who's very graciously, in addition to you and Secretary Cardona, given their time to us today. But perhaps as a way of starting the transition between the conversations, the Texas legislature, despite the all of our NHCSL members in Texas voting against HB 3979, which is currently pending the signature of the governor, because it did pass, among other things, explicitly forbids teaching of the 1619 project. And critics say that although it also effectively bans discussion of the gender pay gap or white privilege, because it would require discussing any current event or controversial issue to explore the topic from diverse and contending perspectives. I wanted to make sure I got the quote right, without giving deference to any one perspective. Now, to be fair, the bill does explicitly require the teaching of the writings of Frederick Douglass, the history of white supremacy, the life of Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, the importance of the American GI Forum, and LULAC. But it still effectively forbids making those topics current by forcing the teaching of a controversy. As a former teacher myself, it really seems to me that it's pretty hard for a teacher to reach students under those constraints and have honest dialogue with students about their thoughts and their understanding of what is taking place. What are your reactions to the bill? What actions have you considered? And unfortunately, in just a couple moments, but still.
So number one, the bill is wrong. And the Florida bill is wrong too. And one could agree or disagree with the conclusions of the 1619 essays. It doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with them. It matters whether or not we equip kids to actually be able to discern fact from fiction, to know what true history is, and to be able to have the context for arriving at their own independent conclusions. So I would actually say to Texas, I would say to Florida, I would say to anyone who has passed this, and whatever fear-mongering they have used, what are you afraid of? Why don't you believe that your kids in all these schools are as good as the kids who went to Texas Boys State? I just saw that documentary. Why not equip them with the facts and with the way to really think about and learn history so that they can draw their own conclusions, as opposed to make something that is very evident invisible. This is unfortunately the way autocrats start. This is unfortunately the way autocracies start. When we start limiting the access to truthful information because we want to draw society to one conclusion. It's very dangerous, it's very wrong, and unfortunately, it's very connected to your next, to the work about disenfranchisement, because a lot of these new limitations on voting are fueled by the big lie that the last election was not decided properly, that Joe Biden did not win the last election fair and square. I often say, how is it that the people in Congress could have won that election fair and square, but using the same electorate, but Joe Biden didn't win that election fair and square?
And they're all on the same ballot.
They're all on the same ballot.
Yes.
But this fueling of this lie, which is said over and over again, which factually has been thrown out of court in so many different ways, the lie is fueling what is very, very dangerous in the country about changing the will of the results from the will of the people. And so it is very disturbing to see, frankly, one party descend into this way of thinking. I don't care. I mean, obviously in elections, I'd rather win than lose. but the will of the people based upon real knowledge, access to voting. That is what keeps a democracy. And frankly, it is for us to fight to keep that democracy.
Wow. Randi Weingarten, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. I want to thank you for not only giving us your analysis, words of wisdom in terms of education and students, but also this incredible introduction to our next session, which we're going to in fact start right now. And so let me turn it over to Kenneth to go ahead and introduce the next session that we're having on the current election bills that are going through our country. Thank you so much for being here.